Greetings. My name is Dr. David Daniels. I'm the Henry Winters Luce Professor of World Christianity at McCormick Theological Seminary in Chicago, Illinois. Today's event is sponsored by Religion Unplugged, the Media Project, and Acton Institute, and some other co-sponsors. This is a three-part series sponsored by Media Project. The first one was last month. This is the September event, and then there will be an October event. The focus of today is Prelude to a Post-Racist Future, African Christians in Europe and America before 1700. So our topic today has us looking at the past in order to seek to rethink the future. Here's some images of some of the people that I will talk about in this presentation. Women and men who lived in either Europe or Africa. And then we'll also talk about some Africans who traveled to Europe. This is all before 1700. And these images, I hope, will be in your mind as you hear the presentation today. The questions that are being asked is, can the history of early modern African Christians offer us insights into constructing a post-racist future? I'm wondering, is it possible that our historical imagination is unable to envision a post-racist future? Does our view of the past somehow normalize racism by our inability to imagine a world prior to the rise of modern racism as a social, political, economic system? And then in what ways does the world of Christians prior to 1700 introduce us to the world before modern racism? So those are the questions that are driving our discussion today. And this is more of a conversation, even though at times I might sound like I'm definitive. But I hope that you hear these more as ways of pondering, thinking, exploring the literature. So our inquiry today is within a discipline called World Christianity. And World Christianity is a discipline that seeks to look at Christianity as a global phenomena, as well as a globalizing phenomena. And World Christianity then generates its own new questions. So here are three that shape our discussion. Did African Christians shape Christianity in Europe and Africa during the early modern period? That's 1500 to 1700. If so, how did they? You'll notice here that this is not a question of how did the West shape the rest, or how did the global South shape global North shape the global South. This is not a question of how did Europeans trod the world. But this is another question. It's asking, how is Europe impacted and shaped and influenced by African Christians and African Christianity? During this time period is also the period of the Renaissance and the period of the Reformation. And as a discipline in World Christianity, I like us to ask the Reformation question. Were African Christians or their Christianity a topic of the Reformation? Did any Catholic or Protestant reformers actually talk about African Christianity or engage African Christians in Europe? And then the third question, and I admit, this third question is the boldest of them all. Did African and European Christians co-create a world prior to the rise of modern racism? If so, what did they co-create or make together? Again, that's the boldest, and for some of you, maybe the most outlandish question of all, that African and European Christians actually created a space, a discourse, a conversation, a world that precedes modern racism and therefore differs from it. So let's talk a little bit about what we mean by before modern racism. So there's a group of scholars who believe racism existed all the way from antiquity. But there's other scholars who believe that racism, or in this case, modern racism, is an invention, a development, a construction that occurs in the late 1600s or early 1700s. So you can read people like Cornel West or George Fredrickson or Catherine Gerbner, and they describe how racism, in particular modern racism as a system, is an invention, a construction of the late 1600s or the 1700s. And here to note that what they're focusing on is that prior to modern racism, there was prejudice against what we now call ethnic groups, prejudice against religions, prejudice against people, even prejudice maybe against people who are African by Europeans. But those prejudices were not institutionalized. They were not state-sponsored. They were not legalized. So I'd like to now say how we can contrast the world of modern racism and the world before modern racism, at least the immediate one. So before and after 1700, before 1700, society is organized around religion. And this is for Europe and Africa. There's the religious hierarchy of people, Christians at the peak, and then Muslims and Jews, at least for Christians. There's a religious hierarchy of knowledge. Christian knowledge, Christian revelation is a superior knowledge. But Europeans debated whether they could learn things from the so-called pagans of the ancient world, Aristotle, Socrates, and others. And then whether they could learn something from Muslims and Jews. Then there's the religious hierarchy of legal rights. Jews had less rights in Europe than Christians did. Muslims had less rights. And even converted Jews and Muslims who had converted to Christianity had less rights. Then there's the religious hierarchy of the value of life. Heretics could be drowned. They could be burned at the stake. And then the religious distribution of capital goods and services. Who could get a royal charter? Who could travel to the Americas or to a Spanish or Portuguese colony? Who had those privileges? And so there's a religious distribution of capital goods and services. Banking within the hands of a certain religious group. But after 1700, or after the late 1600s, society then begins to be organized by race. You have the racial hierarchy of people, and many of you know who is presumed to be on top. You have the racial hierarchy of knowledge. So-called Western knowledge is the zenith of all knowledge. Hierarchy of legal rights. The US Constitution had enslaved Africans as 3/5 of a man or of a person. Racial hierarchy of the value of life. You could treat enslaved people any way that you wanted, but in some cases you could also treat Africans any way you wanted. Take Leopold of Belgium and the Congo. And then the racial distribution of capital goods and services. Jobs, money, banking, all of that was racialized. So if we realize the racialized world, whether it's the apartheid during South Africa, segregation during the United States, and then new forms of racism today around the world, how then do we look at the world prior to 1700? How do we look at how religion shaped the world and not race? I should say that for some people, when you speak of Africans prior to 1700, slavery exhausts the story. Slavery really is the only story. The only thing that is worthy to talk about and worthy of attention is slavery. And for other people, it's colonialism, or both. But I'm suggesting there's a story besides slavery. Slavery is a horrific story, a tragic story. Colonialism is a horrific story, a tragic story. But there are other stories. Africans did more than being part of the slave trade. And in this case, I'm speaking of African Christians. So prior to modern racism, There were elite African Christians who voluntarily migrated to Europe. Prior to modern racism, there were African Christian communities that existed outside of the European-run colonies. Prior to modern racism, there were African Christians who interacted with Europeans, outside of the power structures of slavery and colonialism. And then, prior to modern racism, enslaved people were African, sold in Lisbon and within Mexico City. White Europeans who were sold in Venice, as well as within the Caucasus. South Indians who were sold in Asia. First Peoples, Amerindians who were sold within the Americas. And then we realized that slavery existed for already 2,000 years or more. So what I like to propose is to not deny slavery. Slavery is real, slavery existed, but to say, what is the story in addition to slavery? Here are some numbers to give us a sense of how many African Christians there might have been prior to 1700. And this just takes the year of 1650. In Egypt, there's 700,000 Christians in 1650. In Ethiopia, there's approximately 2.17 million. In other words, 2,170,000 Christians. Within the Congo, there's approximately 150,000 Christians. And then there's 20,000 other Christians within Ndongo, Loango, Cape Verde, São Tomé, Angola, Wari, Benin, Mutapa, Mozambique, and a couple of other places, which makes a total of 3,040,000 African Christians in Africa. Within Europe, in Spain and Portugal, there's approximately 50,000 Christian, probably out of 200,000 Africans who lived in Spain and Portugal at the time. Somewhere around maybe 150 Protestants within England who are Africans. A small community of 10 who are Ethiopians in Rome. In Holland, there's Christians, and Christians in Sicily, Christians in Venice, isolated Christians in Germany and Sweden. And then when Venice was part of the Venetian Republic, there are probably about 50 or more Christians in Venice in the century prior, which makes about 50,160 African Christians in Europe. I mentioned earlier about the voluntary routes that some African Christians used to migrate to Europe in this time period. Between 1402 and 1600s, there's a Mediterranean migration route. And these are Ethiopians traveling from Ethiopia, Jerusalem, Cyprus to mainland Europe. And they're going there as emissaries, ecumenical delegates, pilgrims, and scholars. From 1487 to 1600s, there's an Atlantic coast voluntary migration route of young Congolese nobles to Portugal, basically to get educated. They're, quote, going abroad for an education. And they'll become graduates of St. Eloi Monastery, the University of Coimbra, St. Jerome, St. Augustine's, the Jesuit College, St. Anthony's, and there's a few others. There's also a group that will graduate from Granada, the Cathedral University there. And there's other nobles from Wari and Benin who will also go to Europe for an education. And then in addition to those who are, quote, going abroad to be educated, there are African Christians who are going there as ambassadors. Here's a map, and you can see that the Congo is here. I believe my cursor might be showing. Ethiopia is here. Wari is in this area. Cape Verde is in this area. São Tomé is over in this area. And of course, above is Europe. What is the social reality then? I mentioned already that there does not look like there are any laws legalizing prejudice against Africans. Africans serve in a variety of occupations in Europe, and I'll show some of those occupations in a minute. They are baptized, married, eulogized in Catholic, Protestant, Orthodox churches in Europe. The reason why I say Orthodox is because Cyprus is part of the Venetian Republic, it's part of Europe, and there are Orthodox churches there. Africans own property in Europe. This is seen both in Spain and Portugal, as well as in England. African Christian couples, meaning what we would now call interracial couples, but again, race, I'm arguing, did not exist. So these couples across the continents were legally married in both Europe and in Africa. They were what we would now call interracial marriages in Africa, as well as interracial marriages in England, Spain, and Portugal. And then African Christians served as teachers and priests of Europeans in both Europe and in Africa. There were congregations which we would now call interracial. Europeans and Africans are part of the same congregations, or it might even be an all European congregation. There's a Ethiopian priest who serves as one within the area of Venice, outside of Venice, serves a parish in the 16th century. There are interracial, what we now call interracial parishes within the Congo at this time, and Angola, and Cape Verde, and there are what we would now call interracial congregations within Portugal that would have a priest of African descent. These occupations you can see in Africa starts with monarchs, and I won't read them all, but you can see there's both laborers, priests, there's at least one bishop, there are teachers and principals of schools, which I'll mention in a minute, there's theologians, there's even one college president of African descent within the Congo. In Europe, you'll see that that nobility is recognized as nobility. So there's even some African nobles who marry a European noble woman. Often it's Portuguese. You'll also see that there are at least one bishop who is the bishop to the bishop to the Ethiopian community in Cyprus. This is in the mid 1500s. I already mentioned that there's African priests or priests of African descent, but they also serve as theologians and editors and college professors, at least one in Granada, but there's probably others. Just some names for those who might want to do further research of some of the major African Christians that are shaping the story that I'm telling. So Queen Elena of Ethiopia, or Nzinga Nkuwu of Congo, or King Afonso of Congo, or Bishop Enrique, a Roman Catholic Bishop of Congo. And then you see others from Wari or Timne, which is up in the Sierra Leone area, and Congo again. And then the African Christians who encounter Europeans in Europe, or people of African descent, will be Michael the Deacon, who meets Martin Luther and Philip Melanchthon in 1534. And then there's Tasfa Sion in Rome, or Zaga Zabo in Lisbon. Then there's Vicente Lusitano, who's of African descent, who lived in Portugal, Rome, the Venetian Republic, and then eventually converts to Protestantism and is in Württemberg. He, I believe, is the first Afro-Portuguese Roman Catholic priest to convert to Protestantism, and this is in the late 1550s or early 1560s. Juan Latino, a famous poet of African descent, really he's a full-blood African, as some would say, in Spain in the 1500s, I'm sorry. Mary Phyllis, who's among the first women of African descent to convert to Protestantism, and she converts to Protestantism in England in the late 1500s in London. And then Henry Jetto, who is also in England, also an African Christian, a property owner. He's able to vote within his town. And so these are the kinds of people that I'm describing and that I'm talking about. But in addition to the various occupations, there's sites or entities that Africans govern. So you can see there's both monasteries and parishes and lay societies. And this is in Europe and in Africa. And you can see these lay societies, Our Lady of the Rosary for the enslaved, or Our Lady of the Rosary for Black brothers. And some of these lay societies are in Europe and in Africa. And then the Brotherhood of Benedict of Palermo, he's often called. He will later be called Benedict the Moor. What's really curious about this, Dr. Ayrton lifts up that when you look at some of the studies within Spain, the legal entities that needed to test who were old Christians, Christians who were akin to what we would call white Spanish and Portuguese Christians. And then who were the new Christians? Well, the new Christians were Jewish and Muslim converts, and their families could have converted 2 or 3 generations prior, but they're still new Christians. And they do not have purity of blood. But interestingly, Dr. Chloe Ayrton shows that African Christians, at least over 200 cases, dealing with issues of needing certificates to say that they are old Christians, were designated as old Christians. So even here, they're not seen as converts of a couple of generations, but they're seeing that their Christianity is one that groups them with old Christians, and they're not to be suspected or held in suspect as Jewish and Muslim converts, even if their families converted 3 or 4 generations prior. African Christians are acknowledged and recognized both in Africa and in Europe. And so you have these letters that are published, Queen Elena, Imra Dawit, Tasfa Seyon, and then you see others. And then there are Europeans who, in their writings, either recognize or note the existence of African Christians or African Christianity. Erasmus, Johannes Potkin, Martin Luther, who's a Protestant reformer, Philip Melanchthon, a Protestant reformer, Martin Bucer, a Protestant reformer, Theodore Beza, a Protestant reformer, Anna von Schormann, a Catholic woman, Miguel Cervantes, a Spanish Catholic novelist. So how did the religious or Christian organized society then create this space for African Christians to navigate? Well, I want to say that there's this notion of an ancient Christendom that includes Africa, Asia, and Europe, that then also is recognized as a contemporary Christendom. And so therefore, they're seeing Christians in Europe who are part of Christendom, whose churches are outside of Europe. And they come as lay people, priests, and bishops. There's this Christian cosmopolitanism. It's not this parochial, provincial Europeanism, but it sees that there's a larger world outside of Europe for European Christians, but African Christians see that there's a larger world outside of Africa. There's what could be called a Christian culture of inclusion, what Karina Johnson calls categories of inclusion. How do you welcome nobility, whether they are African, Asian, or European? But nobility is nobility. Blue blood is blue blood. How do you have practices that bring about inclusion? How do you have a Christian coexistence of difference? How do you recognize difference, but say that difference does not need to polarize us? So in the exchange between Martin Luther and Michael the Deacon, or Abba Michael, as some call him, Abba Michael was able to convince Luther said, that while there are differences between German Protestantism and Ethiopian Christianity, those differences are not differences that need to divide us in the faith. Because what holds us in the faith is more important. And so Luther ends up writing a letter of recommendation or reference for Michael the Deacon. Melanchthon also distributes that letter. And in there he says how he was convinced, how he was persuaded by Michael, by Michael the Deacon. Then, if you look at the scientific community that's emerging at this time, the beginning of modern biology, of modern chemistry, you'll see that within the Royal Society of London for Improving Natural Knowledge, which is a scientific society that includes people from Britain, as well as people from London, people from Holland and other places. The scientific consensus was that there was not only a common humanity, but there was a common origin of all people. I believe all these factors together shaped the fact that they could create this space for African Christians to navigate. So between 1500 and 1600, I'd like to now go to the next question, which is, how did African Christians or African Christianities possibly shape the Reformation? So if we're going to read a new narrative of the Reformation, if we're going to deliver new lectures of the Reformation, if we're going to write new journal articles or newspaper articles about the Reformation, what are some things that we might now add if what I'm suggesting really shows to be grounded? One is that there are some scholars who say that Ethiopian Christianity prior to 1541 was seen by some Protestant and Catholics as a third way or a bridge to resolving the Catholic and Protestant divide. Others say that Ethiopian Christianity, like other forms of Orthodox Christianity, is a forerunner of Protestantism. But Ethiopian Christianity is privileged because it is seen as an ancient church that goes back to Acts chapter 8, when what Martin Luther calls the Ethiopian captain or treasurer was converted. Some people call him an Ethiopian eunuch. Third, an alternative way for Roman Catholics to engage Jewish and Muslim families who converted to Christianity. By the time you get to the 1500s, especially as you get into the 1530s and 40s, there's a great suspicion, a hermeneutic of suspicion that's used by Catholics about Jewish and Muslim families who converted. They want to see them eat pork. They want to see them not circumcise their male boys. They want to see them work on Saturday. But there's also a way for Roman Catholic Protestants to deal with the Sabbatarians in their midst. Protestants who recognize Saturday as the Sabbath day, the holy day, the day of Christian worship. And then the Council of Trent and the Christian option for the vernacular Bible, as well as a papal invitation to Ethiopians to attend the Council of Trent in 1561. So those are some things I'd like to talk about next. So this third way or bridge, scholars such as Luis Felipe Tomas and Francisco Betancourt propose how Ethiopian Christianity prior to the colloquy of Regensburg in 1541, that the Ethiopian Bible, its interpretation, Ethiopian Christianity might be a way to overcome the Catholic Protestant divide. Tomas argued that Ethiopian Christianity could be a third way as an ancient church, serving as a potential to show how that one can say this is truly an option because it existed since the first church, since the first Christians, and therefore things that Protestants want to have recognized can be recognized. Married clergy, communion of both kinds, vernacular Bible, and other things. Francisco Betancourt says it's not a third way. He disagrees with Tomas, and he argues that it's a bridge, though. And here he's using the writings of Zaga Zabo, who get widely distributed among the educated elite within Europe in the late 1500s and the 1600s. And Zaga Zabo, who's an Ethiopian theologian, some call him a bishop, he has within his understanding of Christian faith what I would call a theology of ecumenical tolerance. And so therefore, Europeans then could create this irenic vision of the universal church in which all appropriate tendencies could coexist. So there's space for difference to coexist. The forerunner of Christianity, the Protestantism is a forerunner of Ethiopian Christianity, other way around. Ethiopian Christianity is a forerunner of Protestantism. Martin Luther, I think, says this in a variety of ways. Pierre Moulin, another prominent Christian in the late 1500s, also says this. And Job Ludoff, a Protestant, German Protestant from the mid 1600s, also says this. What about a new way of dealing with Jewish and Muslim families that convert to Christianity? Well, one big issue was, how do you interpret Acts chapter 10, where Peter is in has a dream, and in this dream, he's told that he needs to go and evangelize and baptize Gentiles. And in this dream, this different foods and meats are put in front of him. And that in this dream, then he's told to slay and eat. And he says, how can I eat something that's unclean? And in the dream, all is clean, that God, in a sense, has blessed. So Peter then, later in Acts chapter 10, goes to the house of Cornelius, a Roman soldier, and they're asking to be baptized, and he baptizes them. But there's a difference in interpretation. For Catholics, in addition to this notion of evangelizing, they also read it that because all is clean, that then dietary laws no longer apply to Christians. Catholics and Protestants, I should say, read it as abolishing this notion that there's this uncleanness within food. All food now in Christ is edible. Ethiopians said that the text only dealt with evangelism. It only dealt with evangelization. It had nothing to say about dietary rules. And they say that by looking at Acts chapter 15. And so they say, the Ethiopians, and this is Ethiopians like Zaga Zabo in Lisbon, talking to Roman Catholics, having his ideas written down and then distributed. This is like Emperor Claudius also having his ideas written down and explaining it, and having it published in Europe, and Europeans have a chance to debate it. But for Ethiopians, you can't read Acts chapter 10 in isolation from Acts chapter 15. In Acts chapter 15, it made it very clear that dietary laws still could be retained by Jewish Christians, but they could be scaled down for Gentile Christians, but they weren't totally abolished. And so for Ethiopian Christians, they could have dietary laws and therefore see it as a Christian option. Also, Ethiopians practice circumcisions of males and females. And the Catholic reading of Paul's writings was that circumcision was no longer required for Christians. And again, in light of Acts chapter 15, Ethiopians said that circumcision is an option. It's not required for salvation, but it's an option. And so therefore, if dietary laws are a legitimate option for Christians, if circumcision is a legitimate option for Christians, then Muslim and Jewish converts to Christianity will now be even more fearful to Roman Catholics, because then they can't be sure of their conversion, because then they can no longer use a pork test. They can no longer use circumcision and the lack of as a test. And again, the same thing as I just mentioned about the laws, but also the fact of the Sabbath. Zaga Zabo, Emperor Claudius, and others, in books published in Europe in the 1500s, argued that the Saturday is a day that Christians can still observe in addition to Sunday. There can be two Sabbaths. This, of course, is another problem for Catholics concerned about Muslims and Jews who converted to Christianity. Can they still hold to Saturday? And we cannot use a Saturday test. Are you working on Saturday to prove something? But also among Protestants, there are Sabbatarians, Christians in Europe in the 1500s and even before, who are arguing that Christians need to observe Saturday as the Sabbath. So therefore, one can see that the Catholic Church had created this litmus test. No circumcision, eating of pork, not working on Saturday, as a way to try to test the authenticity of the conversion of new converts. And now the Ethiopian Christians, an ancient church, is saying, you really can't do that. And that causes a debate in the 1500s. Interestingly, at the Council of Trent, Ethiopian Christianity also is a topic of discussion. I've only found 2 places, but probably scholars of Trent know even more. But in 1551, there was a debate about whether the Catholic Church should condemn the vernacular as it calls for the Bible in Latin to be the only legitimate authorized Bible. A Spanish theologian by the name of Juan de Ars argued, basically, you can't do that. He says that to his fellow conferees at the Council of Trent. He's there as a consultant. And he says the reason why you can't do that is because within the history of Christianity, there's been Ethiopians, Greeks, and Russians, he calls them Muscovites, who've been doing this. And we don't want to be, Trent doesn't want to go on record as denying, in a sense, the history of Christianity. And so therefore, they end up saying, we need to prohibit it within the Catholic Church, but we must not condemn it within the church. Therefore, recognizing the legitimacy of vernacular translation, basically within the Orthodox churches and within the Slavonic Bible translation, which was used among some of the people in the Slavic areas that had become Catholic, even though they were Orthodox initially. And then interestingly, just to make my point, that in 1561, Pope Pius IV actually writes and sends out a letter to the Emperor of Ethiopia, Negus Minas. And the letter seemingly gets as far as Egypt. And some scholars even think it actually arrives in Ethiopia. But that's not my point. My point is that the Pope wanted the Ethiopian church to be represented at this phase of the Council of Trent. And again, scholars of Trent might know whether there's even earlier places. So we can see now that African Christians have a variety of occupations within Europe, including priests and at least one bishop in Europe and one bishop in Africa. We can see that African Christians and Christianity was a topic during the Reformation on the Catholic and Protestant side. And again, I suspect with a more thorough interpretation, one could find even more places. And now I'd like to go to the most audacious, the boldest claims that I want to make in this presentation. And those claims are that African and European Christians co-created a world, a discourse. They do what I want to argue through theological exchange and production, through an African-European republic of letters, and through a Christian community of nations. The theological exchange and production. So some of the first books that were published in Europe and that were ever printed were books either co-edited by Africans or authored by Africans, or portions of it authored. The first one is in 1513. This is the first book. It's a collection of Psalms and the Song of Solomon as well as some other, what they call hymns of the Old Testament. This was the first book that was published, printed in Europe, that was written in a language, a non-European language other than Hebrew. So Hebrew is the first, this is the second, but it's the first book published in Africa, published from an African language. This is before Arabic, this is before Coptic, this is before Persian, this is before Chinese. This is the first one. And this book is co-edited by a European by the name of Johannes Potkin and by an Ethiopian by the name of Thomas Wada Samuel. And within one of the copies of this book, Samuel, the Ethiopian, writes that he helped co-edit this because Potkin wasn't giving him any credit for it. 1518, Potkin takes that version and he takes the Psalms and places it alongside of Greek, Hebrew, and Latin. They called it Chaldean at that time, but we now recognize it as Ge'ez, the religious language of Ethiopia, liturgical language. In 1548 to 49, we can see the publishing of the New Testament. It was published in two forms. And Dr. Salvadori has noted here in this publication that it's Tessa Sayan who's the one who's overseeing this, translating some of the sections, supervising some of the typographical areas dealing with the print, the print types, the fonts. Then in 1555, a Congo Roman Catholic Catechism is published. And it is noted there that the people who worked for the royal court who knew Portuguese, they're called interpreters, they were part of that project. And so therefore, in the introduction, the European who helps get this published is giving the credit for the translation to the Congolese. In 1653 and 1658, in that period, within London, there are 9 versions of the Bible that are placed together in this multi-volume set of biblical texts. And one of those 9 is the Ethiopian text. And this is the text drawing from Potkin and the text drawing from Tessa Sayan. So therefore, Tessa Sayan's text and Samuel's text show up in this 9 version. And then there's also a Latin translation of those texts. I should let you know, the whole Ethiopian Bible is not translated. There's like 81 books, but just New Testament and some of the books of the Old Testament. And then in 1542, the Catechism is published by a Congolese. He's of Congolese descent. That is in Kikongo, Portuguese, and Latin. Some people say it's published in Kimbangu. So therefore, there's this theological exchange and production that's going on, and some of the first books to be published in Europe, printed in Europe, were books by African Christians, or books that African Christians co-edited. So in creating this African European Republic of Letters, by these Ethiopian texts, many of them, but not all of them, being translated into Latin, letters of Queen Eleni, letters of King or Emperor Dawit, the theological statements of Emperor Claudius, the theological statement of Zaga Zabo, the preface of Tesfa Sayon, all of those are available in Latin. And now Ethiopians and Congolese can hear each other's voices, and Europeans can hear the voices of Africans. But not only the voices, but they can gain knowledge, they can gain insight, and in some cases be persuaded. And this Republic of Letters is in the language of Latin, which is now a language that is now not only a pan-European language of discussion, but also an African-European language of discussion. In this African-European Republic of Letters, there are Ethiopian teachers and European students. It makes sense, doesn't it? How were Europeans first to learn Gaze or Kikangu if someone didn't teach them? And so we know that Thomas Walda Samuel was the teacher for Johannes Potkin, and he taught Johannes in Rome. He taught Potkin in Rome in the early 1510s. And Potkin then develops a dictionary and a grammar book and what's called a syllabary. And so therefore it creates a situation that because of the teachings of Thomas Walda Samuel, now by publishing these dictionaries and glossaries and other things, other Europeans can learn from Thomas Walda Samuel without being in the same room with him. It's an example of how text can teach us a language. But the teacher is Thomas Walda Samuel. Tesfa Sayon is in Rome also, and he teaches a priest by the name of Victori and others in Rome in the 1540s. And then Abba Gregorius is first in Rome in the 1650s, teaching Job Ludolf, maybe even as early as the 1540s. And then Gregorius actually goes to Germany, to Saxe-Gotha, one of the places that's ruled by a duke, and is there for about 3 months. The duke wants to meet him, and he further teaches Ludolf. So he teaches Ludolf in Rome and within Germany, or what becomes Germany. These African-European Republic of Letters then is that you have a group of Europeans now become readers of Gaze. It is as if to be an educated and elite European scholar, there's a group of them that then want to learn Gaze. I won't read all their names, from Conrad Pelikan to Sebastian Munster to Guattieri to Mariano Vittori. And I already mentioned Anna van Schoorman, Job or Rudolph, but there's others on this list if you want to go further. Again, showing that Ethiopian Christianity has a role within the 16th century Europe, within early modern Europe, and within the Reformation. Lastly now, before I make my concluding remarks, there's this Christian community of nations. In the late 1500s, an early political theorist by the name of Jean Bodin includes Ethiopia within the nations and governments of the world. According to him, they are an absolute form of monarchy. And you have to remember that in Europe, monarchies basically ruled Europe until you get to World War I. The French and the Swiss are outliers. Most of Europe in the 16th, 17th, 18th, 19th centuries are governed by European monarchs. And so for Ethiopia to be the purest form, an absolutist form, it's almost like one of the options that's available there, and a way for Europeans to compare themselves in their political construction of society. In this community of nations, there's a call for an Ethiopian-European alliance. For the period we're describing 1500 to 1700, Ethiopian Queen Eleni in the early 1500s is one of the first, but there's also some other Europeans who are asking, and there's also some other Ethiopians before her. And what she's looking for is an alliance between Ethiopia and Europe as Christian nations or Christian peoples, in order for Ethiopia to be able to resist the Muslims, and also maybe help the Europeans resist the Muslims, in this case, often the Ottoman Empire. Recall, the Ottoman Empire controls the southeastern part of Europe, where parts of Hungary, Romania, Bulgaria are. all the way up into World War I. So the issue she's addressing is an issue that will impact Europe from 1452, 53, 1453, all the way up to World War I. And she's trying to work and come up with an alternative by having this alliance. But not only are Ethiopians interested in an alliance, but also the Duke of Saxe-Gotha, I spelled Saxe wrong, S-A-X-E, Saxe-Gotha. He's interested in the 1600s. Ludolf is asked by one of the political leaders within what becomes Germany, within the Holy Roman Empire at this time, to go to England, France, and Holland to see if they'd be willing to come together and request an alliance with Ethiopia. And this is in the late 1600s. And then the French King Louis XIV actually receives a delegation from Ethiopia in France to talk about an alliance, and he agrees to it, but doesn't occur. And then the Polish King Jan Sobieski, also in the same period, is looking for an alliance. And I spelled emperor wrong here, but the Ethiopian emperor Haymanot also is interested in an alliance. But in addition to that, look how emperor, and again, I'm spelling emperor wrong, Teko Haymanot is described in the letter that he's writing to Europe. And this is in the early, like 1701, 1702, 1703, so it's right on the edge of our period. On the part of the most august king, arbiter of nations, shadow of God upon earth, the guide of kings who profess the religion of the Messiah, the most powerful of Christian kings, he that maintains order between Mahometans and Christians, protector of the boundaries of Alexandria, observer of the commandments of the Gospels, descended of the line of the prophets David and Solomon. May the blessing of Israel be upon our prophet and upon them. Note, he recognizes himself as an arbiter of nations. He recognized himself as the most powerful of Christian kings. He sees himself as more powerful than the kings in Europe. And he sees himself as maintaining order between Muslims and Christians. Further in this letter, another letter, I'm sorry, when he's writing on an issue that's dealing with a diplomatic conflict with some of the other nations that are controlled by Muslims in his area, he tells them that we need to all appeal what he calls the law of nations. He is recognizing that there's a law of nations that needs to organize the world. In a way, religion doesn't need to organize the world totally, but a law of nations needs to organize the world. He also called for a religious or ecumenical tolerance. Even within Ethiopia, there's different currents of Christianity or of Orthodox Christianity. And he's recognizing the need to be tolerant about that. And then within the Ethiopian Empire, there are people who practice Islam. There's a small group that practice Judaism, Ethiopian Judaism, and there's people that practice traditional religion. And he calls for religious tolerance. He doesn't call for a war of religions. He's calling for religious tolerance in the empire that he governs. And so therefore, in this community of nations, Ethiopia has a voice. Jean Baudin recognizes Ethiopia as being a nation, a government. And even after this period, there's other theorists that will recognize Ethiopia as part of the community of governments, community of nations. So let's now end where we began. How do we talk about engaging the past to envision the future. How do we then learn from a pre-racist past in order to construct a post-racist future? Here's some things I'd like to lift up. We obviously should not be focusing on a religious hierarchy of people, but we clearly no longer should have a racial hierarchy of people. And so what maybe we can learn from this is to develop an equality of people. Equality where race nor religion is the defining factor. An equality of different knowledge that as in this, what I call African European Republic of Letters, there's an exchange of knowledge. They are learning from each other. They are getting names of who this Ethiopian captain is, who the Queen of Sheba is. The Ethiopians are giving them the names of the people, who the Queen of Ethiopia was during the time of the Ethiopian captain, as Luther says, because Candace is another name for queen. So we get knowledge, the equal legal rights and just enforcement of rights. So not merely having equal legal rights, as it looks like the Africans had prior to 1700. And again, I'm not necessarily speaking of the enslaved population, but even in the enslaved population, some of them were able to get the right to sell fish at the market in the 1500s against white Portuguese. The royal government supported them, and they got charters from the royal monarch, royal charters to exist as lay societies, what some people call confraternities or brotherhoods or slave societies. But we need to have the just enforcement of those rights. It's not enough to have the rights on the books. They must be enforced. We need to have equal value of life and a government enforced practice of those values. All lives must be equal. In the language of the United States today, Black Lives Matter. We must have the just distribution of capital, goods, and services. There needs to be a just sharing and distribution. And then lastly, a just and peaceable coexistence of difference. Difference does not have to be the cause of polarization, the cause of discrimination, the cause of marginalization, the cause of exclusion. There can be a just and peaceful coexistence of difference. Thank you. Let me now go to our questions. Appreciate your listening, and we now have some questions that have been given by the audience, by the listening audience. And let me see if I can start with them all. So the first question I was been asked is that there's curious about what overall African population and overall European population curious about the overall African population, overall European population would like at the time, to put these numbers in perspective. I do have those numbers in my notes, but I don't have those numbers right before me. So if I give another version of this, I'll add those numbers. Second question, was the Euro-Christian legal system of prescription hyper-organized justice similar to African Christianity? Alternatively, was the African Christian legal ideology closer to the more relational system you see in ancient Israel? That's an interesting question, and a historian of the legal system in Africa and in Europe, or legal systems in Africa and Europe, could better answer that. But let me tell you what I know. So within the Kingdom of Congo, the Congo is a place where a council, which includes women, um, in, for whom the king works with in order to make decisions. Um, Again, a scholar of the Congolese legal system at this time will probably answer this better. But the way I understand it is that the king does not make a decision, a legal decision, independent of this council. And again, men and women are on this council, though I think it's majority men. And this council is not an advisory council. Somehow it's a deliberative council in which the king, if I understand it right, engages in that deliberation, and then a decision is made, and then the king then pronounces that decision. I should say that one of the things you need to note about Christianity in the Congo at that time is that by 1514, there's a school system that's set up. By 1616, the school system has about 1,000 students in it, including a male and female division, a division for boys and division of girls. And so throughout the 1500s and early 1600s, there is an educated Congolese elite. They're often of the nobility class, as we would call it, but they're nobles. But there's a large number that would be in the thousands by the time you get to 1600s. So this group of counselors would be educated people who could both read and write Kikongo, Latin, and possibly even Portuguese. King Afonso, in addition to reading religious texts, and he's the king, the second Christian king of the Congo. This is early 1500s. He also reads Portuguese legal texts. And so therefore he has some knowledge of at least the legal system within Portugal. So except for maybe Switzerland, which possibly has a judicial system that's akin to what we're describing, I think there's at least more relational, consultative, at least within the Congo. Though I don't know, my sense is in Ethiopia that the monarch has a lot of power, and therefore it's unlike the government in the Congo. And possibly the European system might be similar to the Congolese, to the Ethiopian. The difference would be that we have the laws that begin to emerge within England, with the and that you also have laws in other places. So again, I think that's a great question, and I think there might be some exchange, but I don't believe that the legal system in Europe was impacted by African Christianity. Next question. Is this all gathered from many sources, or is there one book somewhere that gives more background to the wealth of knowledge? Unfortunately, there's not one source, and I meant to add a bibliography, but I can give you some names of scholars that you might look at. There's scholars that focus on England. Miranda Kaufman focuses on England. On Dr. Salvatore and Dr. James De Renzi, they focus on Ethiopian Christianity, along with Samantha Kelly. There are people who are focusing on the Congo, John Thornton, Linda Hayward. So unfortunately, it's bringing in together people from Ethiopian studies, people who are coming from early modern Black European studies, people that's focusing on African church history. All of these are coming together to inform what I'm presenting today. Next question. Is there evidence of the Ethiopian church engaging in missionary ventures in other parts of Africa between 1500 and 1700? Ethiopia definitely engages in missionary activity within its surrounding places, and it's expanding its empire as it's doing that. And so yes, so there are other Christians outside those within the highlands of Ethiopia that then begin to embrace Christianity. But there's also then some that will convert to Islam or within this. And then there's some issues around what happens with Jews. Some of them are forced, it looks like, to convert, but all of them don't convert. But there is missionary activity within that area around Ethiopia. Even though you didn't ask about the Congo, there's also missionary activity with the Congolese in their neighboring areas. So they send people out to Ndongo, Loango, and other places, evangelizing, as we would say, in missionary ventures. So they do go in their areas. There's also, interestingly, the education of the Congolese in particular, but also some other Africans in this time period who are Christians. And you could be educated either at the theological college within the Congo in Mombasa, which is also called South Salvador, or you could be educated within the theological college with the Luanda, which is a Portuguese colony. You could be theologically educated in São Tomé, which is a colony island or set of islands off the coast of Africa. You could also have a theological education by the 1600s in Cape Verde. And the church in Cape Verde and São Tomé was supposedly all people of all African descent except for the bishop. So the musicians, the canons, the priests were all of African descent. And then, as I mentioned, you could be educated within Europe on the Catholic side. And these who are educated then are also providing missionary activity in different parts of Africa. And then my understanding is some actually even go to the Americas. The next question. How can religious leaders in America be better connected to this pre-1700 idea? I'm on the same page with this person who asked that question. I think there's both an education, because unfortunately, the story of slavery exhausts the whole story of what it's like to be an African prior to 1700. And if it's not slavery, then it's the story of colonialism. And if it's not the story of colonialism, then it's the story of Africans practicing traditional religion. And yes, Africans, the majority did practice traditional religion. Yes, there were Africans who were Muslims, but there were also Africans who were Christians. So how do we understand that? How do we understand the society they built? How can journalists help us understand the backstory to the modern period? And this backstory is one to be able to allow us to be able to understand modern racism better. Because then we can understand that it, at least in my understanding, it did not have to be. That there's political and economic reasons why modern racism was erected and why modern racism is now perpetuated. And so if we could expose, take the cover off, maybe then knowing the world before can help us then imagine what the world could be afterwards. Next question. How do you think this pre-1700 and post-1700 divide you presented changes the nature of the discussion that we're having about race in the United States? Well, the first thing is, I don't think you want to then reduce racism to prejudice. Racism is more than prejudice. Racism is a system. Next, if we do argue that racism is not something that's within Western culture, going back all the way to antiquity, but that in my language, modern racism is construction after 1700, then how do we study this period before to get ideas about how do we think about the future? Also, I think if you go back to my list, maybe race, we shouldn't be talking about prejudice alone. We shouldn't really talk about discrimination alone, but we should be talking about strategies of marginalization and exclusion. And how do you then enforce and codify those? Well, it goes back to my list. A racial hierarchy of people, a racial hierarchy of knowledge, a racial hierarchy of the value of life, a racial distribution of capital, goods, and services. Maybe if we talk about race in those terms, then maybe we can see the need is to end the racial disparities that are caused by those racial hierarchies. And so I think maybe that is what can help us. And maybe it can also help us to see that religion, there's currents within religion in the pre-1700s that was moving towards a common humanity, A notion of religious engagement, maybe even religious equality between Christians of African and European descent. Maybe even learn that how do we understand that kind of religion? What was religion clustered with then in order to make that possible? Does the person want to know if I can share the bibliography? Yes, I'd be glad to. I will just have to figure out with Religion Unplugged and the Media Project how we can make that possible. But yes, I'd be glad to. Then there's a note that racism is a problem in Latin America too, from Spanish colony now. And I would say yes to that. And I would say that we could all learn. So that's why this is not merely a US problem, but it's a problem that affects a number of places. And Christianity has a role in working towards, moving towards a post-racist future. And then lastly, a just and peaceable coexistence of difference is what is needed in the current racial climate in the world. Who should be driving this? I guess I'm democratic on that. And I would say everybody needs to be involved. I'm a reader of people who speak of a post-secular society. And so in this post-secular society, secularists realize that religion is needed and realize there needs to be a place for those who are non-religious. Realizing that religious people need to learn secular vocabulary and need to learn how to speak in the public arena, but also secularists need a theological education, and they need to learn the vocabulary of Islam and Christianity and Judaism and Yoruba religion and Hinduism and Confucianism and Zoroastrianism. They need to learn that too. And that as we learn each other's language, we can then find a way to move forward with a just and peaceful coexistence of difference, I believe. But it will take both the religious communities, a variety of religious persuasions and faiths, and secularists. And then I think this is the last question here. Do we know if other faiths such as Islam, Judaism, or others have history of showing pathways to a post-racist future? I think the answer is yes. The whole notion of the community within Islam, for instance, the story of Malcolm X, of going to Mecca and seeing Muslims from Europe, as well as Muslims from Africa and Asia coming together, and he seeing himself no longer as an African-American only, but as a Muslim without race being the defining factor. So yes, I think there's resources. There's resources in Judaism, as Judaism realized even in the 1600s that there were Africans who were Jews, and then Ethiopian Jews now in Israel, as long as they're treated with equality, and other religions also doing the same. Thank you very much. And I'm now going to sign off and express my appreciation to you for listening, and to thank you all for being with us today, and pray that all of us can help us move towards a post-racist future.